When Ethan Cole walked into Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant that evening, he thought he was finally ready to close the chapter on his biggest regret. But when the woman he'd never stopped loving suddenly appeared at his table, trembling with fear and whispering, "Pretend you're my husband," he realized some chapters were meant to be rewritten. What happened next would either destroy them both or give them the second chance they never thought they'd get. Welcome to tonight's story of love, betrayal, and redemption. Stay with me until the very end, and please comment with your city so I can see how far this tale of second chances has traveled across the world. The October rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Le Bernardin, each droplet catching the amber glow of the restaurant's crystal chandeliers. Ethan Cole sat alone at table 17, his calloused hands wrapped around a glass of bourbon that had long since grown warm. The irony wasn't lost on him, a construction supervisor in a $3,000 suit, dining in a place where the appetizers cost more than his crew's daily wages. But tonight wasn't about the money. Tonight was about closure. For 2 years, Ethan had orchestrated this moment with the precision of an architect designing a skyscraper. He'd researched Isabella Grant's schedule, learned her habits, discovered that she dined here every third Thursday of the month. Always alone. Always at 8:30. Always ordering the same thing, the tasting menu with wine pairings, though she rarely touched more than a few sips of each glass. He knew because he'd been watching. Not in a creepy stalker way, at least, that's what he told himself. But in the way a man watches the woman who got away, the one who haunted his dreams, and made every other relationship feel like a pale imitation of what love could be. Isabella Grant, CEO of Grant Industries, worth more money than most small countries, and the woman who'd walked out of his life 10 years ago without looking back. Ethan checked his Rolex, a gift from his daughter Emma, for his 40th birthday, bought with money she'd saved from her part-time job at the local coffee shop. 8:25. His heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to escape his chest. "More bourbon, sir." The waiter appeared beside him, silent as a shadow. "No, thank you." Ethan's voice came out rougher than intended. He cleared his throat. "Actually, yes. Make it a double." The waiter nodded and glided away, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts and the weight of a decade's worth of regret. He'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his mind. What he'd say, how he'd say it. Whether she'd even remember him or if he'd become just another face in the crowd of her meteoric rise to power. The truth was, he'd never stopped loving her. Through his disastrous marriage to Sarah, through the messy divorce, through the sleepless nights, raising Emma on his own, Isabella had been there, a constant ache in his chest, a reminder of the man he could have been if he'd been brave enough to fight for what mattered. But he hadn't been brave. He'd been young and stupid and scared, letting his father's voice echo in his head. "She's out of your league, son. Rich girls like that, they play with boys like you for fun, then go back to their own kind." Well, he wasn't a boy anymore. At 42, Ethan had built his construction company from nothing, raised a daughter who was smarter and stronger than he'd ever dreamed of being, and learned that league had nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with character. The bourbon arrived, and Ethan took a sip, feeling the familiar burn slide down his throat. 8:28. She'd be here any minute, assuming she kept to her routine. Assuming she... The breath left his lungs in a rush. There she was. Isabella Grant stood at the restaurant's entrance, and for a moment time folded in on itself. She was still the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, but there was something different about her now. The girl he'd known had been confident, yes, but with an underlying softness, a vulnerability that had drawn him like a moth to flame. This woman, This woman looked like she'd been forged in fire and emerged as something harder, more polished, but infinitely more fragile. Her dark hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and she wore a black dress that probably cost more than his truck. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. Those same green eyes that had once looked at him like he hung the moon now darted around the restaurant, with the wariness of a hunted animal. She was afraid. The maitre d' led her to her usual table number 12 with a view of the kitchen and easy access to both exits. Ethan had done his research. But as she moved across the restaurant, her gaze swept the room and landed on him. For one heartbeat, too, they stared at each other across the crowded dining room. Recognition flared in her eyes, followed immediately by something that looked like panic. She stumbled slightly, her hand gripping the back of a chair for support. Then she was moving again, but not toward her table. She was walking toward him, her face pale as moonlight, her steps quick and purposeful despite the tremor in her hands. Ethan. Her voice was barely a whisper when she reached his table. Ethan Cole. He stood so fast he nearly knocked over his chair. Isabella. Hi. Up close he could see the fine lines around her eyes, the barely concealed exhaustion that expensive makeup couldn't quite hide. She was 38 now, he knew, but she looked older. The weight of responsibility, of power, of something else he couldn't name, had carved itself into the delicate bones of her face. What are you doing here? She glanced over her shoulder, a quick, nervous movement that set every protective instinct he had on high alert. I was hoping to see you. The words came out stilted, rehearsed. Nothing like the smooth speech he'd practiced. I know this is probably weird, but oh God. Her face went white. He's here. Who's here? Isabella's hands were shaking now, and she pressed them flat against the table. My ex-husband, Victor. I didn't think he knew about this place, but... She looked around frantically, and Ethan followed her gaze to see a tall, silver-haired man in an expensive suit scanning the restaurant. Victor Hale. Ethan recognized him from the business pages of the New York Times. Isabella's ex-husband, a corporate shark who'd married her 5 years ago and divorced her 2 years later in a spectacularly public and vicious battle that had dominated the tabloids for months. Isabella. Victor's voice carried across the restaurant, smooth as silk and cold as winter. He was moving toward them now, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. What a pleasant surprise. Ethan watched Isabella's entire body tense, watched her hands curl into fists at her sides. Whatever history these two shared, it wasn't pleasant. And judging by the way she'd paled at the sight of him, it wasn't over either. That's when she did something that changed everything. Isabella Grant, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, a woman who commanded boardrooms and bent senators to her will, turned to Ethan with desperation in her eyes and whispered 6 words that shattered his carefully constructed world. Pretend you're my husband. Please. Before he could process what she was asking, before he could even begin to understand the implications, Victor Hale was standing at their table, his pale blue eyes taking in the scene with the cold calculation of a predator sizing up its prey. Isabella, Victor said, again his voice dripping with false warmth. I had no idea you'd be here tonight. And his gaze shifted to Ethan, dismissive and calculating. I'm sorry, I don't believe we've been introduced. Ethan felt Isabella's hand brush against his, the touch electric and desperate. He thought of the girl she'd been, the woman she'd become, the fear in her eyes. He thought of his daughter Emma, who'd raised herself on feminist literature and self-defense classes, who'd be ashamed if he didn't step up when a woman needed help. But mostly, he thought of the fact that Isabella Grant, the only woman he'd ever truly loved, had asked him for help, and he'd be damned if he'd let her down again. Ethan Cole, he said, extending his hand to Victor, while sliding his other arm around Isabella's waist. The lie came easier than breathing. Isabella's husband. The effect was immediate and electric. Victor's composure cracked for just a moment, surprise flashing across his features before the mask slipped back into place. Isabella's body relaxed minutely against his side, though he could still feel the tension thrumming through her like a live wire. Husband. Victor's laugh was sharp and brittle. How fascinating. I hadn't heard that our dear Isabella had remarried. We're very private people, Ethan said smoothly, his hand tightening protectively on Isabella's waist. We prefer to keep our personal lives out of the headlines. Indeed. Victor's smile grew sharper. And what is it you do, Mr. Cole? I'm afraid I don't recognize the name from any of our social circles. There it was, the subtle dig, the implication that Ethan didn't belong in Isabella's world. It was the same song Victor's type had been singing for generations, the same tune his own father had hummed when he'd warned Ethan away from girls like Isabella. But Ethan wasn't 22 anymore, and he'd learned a thing or two about power in the past decade. Real power didn't come from trust funds or board positions. It came from knowing who you were and refusing to apologize for it. Construction, Ethan said simply. I build things that last. The double meaning hung in the air between them like a challenge. Victor's eyes narrowed, and for a moment the civilized veneer slipped completely, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. How blue-collar of you. Victor's tone made it sound like a disease. I'm surprised Isabella didn't mention her situation when we spoke last week. Isabella stiffened beside him. We didn't speak last week, Victor. Didn't we? Victor tilted his head, his smile turning predatory. I could have sworn we had a lovely conversation about the quarterly reports and the irregularities in the Seattle project funding. Such a shame when numbers don't add up, don't you think? The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Ethan didn't understand the specifics, but he understood intimidation when he heard it. His hand moved from Isabella's waist to her shoulder, a gesture of both comfort and possession that wasn't lost on Victor. Is there something you needed, Victor? Isabella's voice was steady now, some of her CEO composure returning. Because my husband and I were having a private dinner. Of course, of course. Victor raised his hands in mock surrender. I wouldn't dream of intruding on such a intimate occasion. Though I do hope we'll have a chance to catch up soon, Isabella. There's so much we need to discuss. He turned to go, then paused, looking back at Ethan with calculating eyes. Mr. Cole, was it? I'll have to look you up. I'm always interested in meeting Isabella's friends. The way he said friends made it clear he wasn't buying their story for a second. But he was backing down for now, and that was all that mattered. They watched him walk away, weaving through the restaurant, until he disappeared through the entrance. Only when he was completely out of sight did Isabella sag against Ethan, her careful composure crumbling like a house of cards. Thank you, she whispered, her voice shaking. God, thank you. Ethan guided her to her chair, his mind reeling from what had just happened. Are you okay? Do you need water, wine, something stronger? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. I need a lot of things, but most of them aren't available on the menu. The waiter appeared at their table as if summoned by some invisible signal. Good evening. Would you care to see our wine list? Yes, Isabella said before Ethan could answer. Something strong and expensive. Very expensive. When the waiter left, an awkward silence settled between them. Ethan found himself studying her face, cataloging the changes the years had wrought. She was still beautiful, heartbreakingly so, but there was a brittleness to her now that hadn't been there before. Like glass that had been cracked, but not yet shattered. "So," he said finally, "this is not how I imagined our reunion going." Isabella looked up at him, and for a moment her carefully constructed mask slipped. He saw the girl he'd known 10 years ago, the one who'd laughed at his terrible jokes and fallen asleep in his arms after they'd spent hours talking about everything and nothing. "You imagined our reunion?" she asked softly. Heat crept up his neck. Maybe. Sometimes." "What did you imagine?" The question hung between them, loaded with a decade's worth of unspoken words. Ethan took a sip of his bourbon, buying time. "Honestly, I imagined you telling me to go to hell." That earned him a genuine smile, the first one he'd seen from her all evening. "The night is young." Their wine arrived, a bottle of something French and prohibitively expensive that the sommelier presented with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. Isabella waved away the tasting ritual and nodded for him to pour. "To unexpected reunions," she said, raising her glass. "To pretend husbands," Ethan countered. They drank, and he watched her shoulders relax fractionally as the alcohol hit her system. "I should explain," she said, setting down her glass. "About Victor. About all of this." "You don't owe me an explanation." "Yes, I do." Her green eyes met his, steady and serious. "You just saved me from God knows what, and you don't even know why I needed saving." Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "Why don't you start with why you're afraid of your ex-husband?" Isabella's laugh was bitter. "How much time do you have?" "All night if you need it." Something flickered in her eyes at that, surprise maybe, or gratitude. When was the last time someone had offered her all the time she needed? "Victor and I were married for 3 years. She began, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. "It was not a good marriage. He's the kind of man who sees relationships as acquisitions, and I was a very valuable acquisition. The company, among other things." Her voice was carefully neutral, but Ethan caught the undertone of pain. "When my father died, I inherited controlling interest in Grant Industries. Victor saw an opportunity. And you saw a man who claimed to love me." She shrugged, but there was nothing casual about the gesture. "I was 33, successful but lonely. My father had just died, and I was drowning in grief and responsibility. Victor was charming, attentive, everything I thought I wanted. But charm and love aren't the same thing." She took another sip of wine. "It took me a while to figure that out. By the time I did, we were already married, and he'd positioned himself as my right hand at the company. Extricating myself from the marriage was complicated." Ethan thought about the headlines he'd seen during their divorce proceedings. The leaked emails, the accusations of infidelity and financial impropriety. The character assassination that had played out in the public eye. "He didn't make it easy," he said. "That's an understatement." Isabella's smile was sharp as a blade. "Victor doesn't like to lose. And he really doesn't like to lose to a woman." "Is that what tonight was about, him not liking to lose?" Isabella hesitated, and Ethan saw something flicker across her face, fear, anger, something darker. "There are some irregularities in our Seattle project," she said finally. "Missing funds, forged documents, the kind of thing that could destroy the company if it came to light. And Victor knows about it. Victor orchestrated it." Her voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "He's been systematically undermining Grant Industries ever since our divorce was finalized, setting up scenarios that make me look incompetent or corrupt. He's playing a long game. To what end? To force me out. To buy back into the company when my reputation is in ruins and the stock price has tanked. Isabella's hands clenched around her wine glass. He wants to take everything my father built and make it his own. Ethan felt anger rising in his chest, hot and protective. Can you prove it? I'm working on it. But Victor's smart, and he's patient. He's been setting this up for 2 years. What about tonight? Why was he here? Isabella was quiet for a long moment, staring into her wine as if it held answers. I think he knows I'm getting close to exposing him, she said finally. And men like Victor, when they're cornered, she trailed off, but Ethan understood. They get dangerous. Yes. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her words settling between them. Ethan found himself studying her face again, seeing not the polished CEO, but the frightened woman who'd asked him to pretend to be her husband. Why me? He asked suddenly. What? You could have asked anyone in this restaurant to help you. Half the men in here would probably kill for the chance to play your husband even temporarily. So why me? Isabella looked at him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face as if looking for something. Because, she said finally, you're the only man I've ever trusted completely. The words hit him like a physical blow. He set down his wine glass with unsteady hands. Isabella, I know. She held up a hand. I know I don't have the right to say that. Not after what happened between us. Not after I chose... You chose your father, Ethan said quietly. You chose your family and your future and everything that made sense. I understood that then, and I understand it now. Do you? Her voice was barely a whisper. Because I've regretted it every day for 10 years. The restaurant seemed to fade around them, the chatter of other diners and the clinking of silverware becoming white noise. There was only Isabella looking at him with eyes full of decade-old pain and the weight of all the words they'd never said. Isabella, I know it's too late, she continued, her voice gathering strength. I know I made my choice and I have to live with it. But seeing you tonight, having you step in without hesitation, it reminded me of who I used to be. Before the company, before Victor, before I learned to be afraid of my own shadow. Ethan reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Her skin was cold, and he could feel the slight tremor in her fingers. You're not that afraid, woman, he said firmly. You're Isabella Grant. You run a billion-dollar company. You survived a marriage to a predator and came out stronger. You're not afraid of anything. I'm afraid of a lot of things. Her smile was sad. I'm afraid of failure. I'm afraid of being alone. I'm afraid that Victor will destroy everything my father built, and it'll be my fault for not being strong enough to stop him. And I'm afraid, she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, that the best thing that ever happened to me walked out of my life 10 years ago, and I was too proud and too scared to go after him. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge, fragile, dangerous, but offering the possibility of crossing the chasm that had separated them for a decade. Ethan stared at her, his heart hammering against his ribs. Isabella, I know it's selfish, she said quickly. I know I have no right to drag you into this mess. You have a life, a daughter. How do you know about Emma? A flush crept up her neck. I may have kept tabs on you over the years. You kept tabs on me. I hired a private investigator, she admitted, not meeting his eyes. I wanted to know that you were okay, that you were happy. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, a door that had been locked for 10 years, creaking open. Are you happy? She asked, her voice small. It was such a simple question, but it knocked the breath out of him. Was he happy? He loved his daughter more than life itself, and he'd built a successful business from nothing. He had friends, a nice house, a life that looked good on paper. But happy, I thought I was, he said honestly. Until tonight. And now he was sitting across from the woman he'd never stopped loving, who'd just told him she'd regretted letting him go for 10 years. Now he was remembering what it felt like to want something so badly, it hurt to care about someone more than his own safety. Now he was falling all over again, and he wasn't sure whether to be terrified or grateful. Now I don't know anything anymore, he said. Their food arrived, dishes neither of them had ordered, but which the restaurant's chef had apparently selected for them. Isabella poked at her sea bass without much interest, while Ethan found himself too wound up to eat. "Tell me about your daughter," Isabella said, clearly trying to steer the conversation into safer waters. Ethan's face lit up immediately. "Emma. She's 18, a senior in high school. Valedictorian captain of the debate team, accepted early admission to Columbia. Following in her father's footsteps. God, no. She wants to be a civil rights lawyer, says she's going to save the world one case at a time. She sounds amazing. She is. She's smarter than I ever dreamed of being, and twice as stubborn. She gets that from her mother. And from you. The stubbornness, definitely from me." Isabella smiled, and for a moment, she looked like the girl he'd known in college. "I'd like to meet her someday." The casual words hit harder than they should have. Would there be a someday? Would Isabella want to be part of his life after tonight? Or was this just a moment out of time, a brief respite from the storm of her real world? "She'd like you," he said. "She's got a thing for powerful women who don't take crap from anyone. Smart girl. She is. She's also the reason I can't just walk away from this." Isabella looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Emma was raised on stories about standing up to bullies and protecting people who can't protect themselves. If she found out I had the chance to help someone help you, and I walked away because it was easier..." He shook his head. "She'd never forgive me, and I'd never forgive myself." "Ethan, this isn't your fight." "Yes, it is." The words came out more forcefully than he'd intended. "The moment you asked me to pretend to be your husband, it became my fight. I just needed him to back off for one night. I didn't mean..." "I know what you meant," Ethan said softly. "But that's not how this works. That's not how I work." Isabella stared at him, and he saw something shift in her expression. Recognition, maybe, or memory. "You always were too noble for your own good," she murmured. "And you always were too proud to accept help when you needed it." They looked at each other across the table, years of history and hurt and unspoken love stretching between them like a bridge made of light. "So what do we do now?" Isabella asked finally. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling like he was about to jump off a cliff without knowing if there was water at the bottom. "Now," he said, "you tell me everything. Every detail about Victor's plan, every piece of evidence you have, every dirty trick he's pulled. And then we figure out how to destroy him before he destroys you. And after that, Ethan said, reaching across the table to take her hand, we figure out what 10 years apart has cost us and whether we're brave enough to try again." Isabella's fingers intertwined with his, and for the first time all evening, her smile reached her eyes. "I've been afraid of a lot of things," she said. "But I've never been afraid of being brave with you." Outside, the October rain continued to fall, washing the city clean. And inside Le Bernardin, at table 17, two people who'd thought they'd lost their chance at happiness began to discover that some love stories don't end. They just wait for the right moment to begin again. The rain had stopped by the time they left Le Bernardin, but the October air still carried the sharp bite of autumn and the promise of winter. Isabella pulled her coat tighter around herself as they stepped onto the sidewalk, the city lights reflecting off wet pavement like scattered diamonds. "My driver's waiting," she said, nodding toward a sleek black sedan idling at the curb. "I can drop you." "No." Ethan's voice was firm. "We need to talk, and we need privacy. Real privacy, not the kind you get in the back of a car with a driver who probably reports to your board of directors." Isabella hesitated, glancing around the street with that same nervous energy he'd noticed in the restaurant. "Victor might be watching." "Then let him watch me take my wife home." The word felt strange on his tongue, wife, but also strangely right. "Where do you live?" "Upper East Side." "But Ethan, if he sees you going to my apartment, then he'll see exactly what we want him to see." Ethan stepped closer, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something expensive and subtle that made his head spin. "We're married, remember, married couples go home together." For a moment, Isabella looked like she wanted to argue. Then her shoulders sagged slightly, and he saw the exhaustion she'd been hiding all evening. "Okay," she said quietly. "But I should warn you, my place isn't exactly cozy." That turned out to be the understatement of the century. Isabella's penthouse apartment occupied the entire top floor of a pre-war building on Fifth Avenue, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Central Park. The interior was all clean lines and neutral colors, beautiful, but sterile like a spread from Architectural Digest. "It's..." Ethan paused in the foyer, taking in the marble floors and abstract art. "Impressive." "It's cold," Isabella said, hanging her coat in a closet that was bigger than his daughter's bedroom. "I know it's cold." The decorator said it projected success and sophistication. "What do you say?" She was quiet for a moment, looking around the space as if seeing it through his eyes. "I say it feels like a very expensive hotel room." Ethan followed her into the living room, noting the lack of personal touches. No family photos, no books lying around, no evidence that anyone actually lived here. It was beautiful, but it felt empty, lonely. "Can I get you something to drink?" Isabella asked, already moving toward a bar cart that looked like it belonged in a high-end restaurant. "I have excellent bourbon, and wine, and probably things I've forgotten I own." "Bourbon's fine." Ethan settled onto one of the sleek couches, watching her pour their drinks. Her hands were steadier now, away from Victor's predatory gaze, but he could still see the tension in her shoulders. "Isabella." She handed him his glass, then sat on the opposite end of the couch, carefully maintaining distance between them. "You're safe here. You know that, right?" Her laugh was shaky. "Safe is a relative term when you're dealing with Victor Hale." "Tell me about the Seattle project. The missing funds you mentioned." Isabella took a large sip of her bourbon, wincing slightly as it burned down her throat. Grant Industries is developing a mixed-use complex in downtown Seattle. Residential, commercial, some affordable housing units. It's a $200 million project. And someone's been skimming money from the construction budget. Small amounts at first, spread across multiple contractors, but it's added up. We're talking about nearly $10 million over the past 18 months. Ethan whistled low. "That's not small potatoes." "No, it's not. And the way it's been done, the paper trail leads directly back to me. My signature on approval forms my authorization codes used for fund transfers. If this comes to light, it won't just destroy the company, it'll destroy me personally. I could go to prison." "But you didn't do it." "Of course I didn't do it." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, and she immediately looked apologetic. Sorry, it's just trying to prove I didn't do something when all the evidence says I did is like trying to prove a negative. Ethan leaned forward, studying her face. But you have some proof that Victor's behind it. Some. Not enough. Isabella got up and walked to the windows, staring out at the park. Victor had access to my office for 3 years. He knew my passwords, my authorization codes, my signature. He could have set this up any time during our marriage. And you think he's been planning this since before your divorce? I think Victor's been planning this since before we got married. Her voice was bitter. I think our entire relationship was a long con, designed to get him close enough to the company to destroy it from the inside. The words hung heavy in the air between them. Ethan felt a surge of anger so strong, it surprised him, not just at Victor, but at the system that had allowed a predator like him to get close to Isabella in the first place. What kind of proof do you have? He asked. Isabella turned back to him, and he saw something flicker in her eyes. Hope, maybe. Or determination. Email records. Financial statements showing unusual patterns in his consulting firm's income that coincide with the missing funds. Security footage of him in my office during off hours. She paused. And one very interesting conversation I recorded before our divorce was finalized. Recorded how, let's just say I learned not to trust my husband well before I decided to leave him. Isabella's smile was sharp. Victor has a habit of bragging when he drinks. And he has a habit of drinking when he thinks he's won. Ethan felt a spark of admiration. You played him. I tried to, but the recording isn't admissible in court. I obtained it without his consent. And the other evidence is circumstantial at best. A good lawyer could tear it apart. But it's a start. It's a start, she agreed. The problem is I'm running out of time. The board is starting to ask questions about the Seattle project. If Victor pushes hard enough, they could vote to remove me as CEO while they conduct an investigation. And by the time you're cleared, the damage will be done. The stock price will tank, the company's reputation will be in ruins, and Victor will swoop in with a buyout offer that the board will be desperate enough to accept. Ethan stood and walked over to where she was standing by the windows. The city sprawled out below them, millions of lights twinkling in the darkness. So, we don't let him push, he said simply. Isabella looked up at him, and he saw something vulnerable in her expression. Ethan, you don't understand what you're signing up for. Victor doesn't play fair. He'll go after anyone he sees as a threat. Let him try. I'm serious. He'll investigate you, dig up every secret you've ever had, use anything he finds against both of us. He destroyed my reputation during our divorce by leaking fake evidence of an affair. He could do the same to you. Ethan was quiet for a moment, thinking about his own life. His failed marriage, his struggles as a single father, the mistakes he'd made along the way. None of it was pretty, but none of it was worth hiding from either. I've got nothing to hide, he said finally. I'm a construction worker from Queens who raised his daughter and built a small business. Victor can investigate all he wants. What about Emma? What if he goes after her? The question hit him like a physical blow. His daughter was his weak spot, and they both knew it. Emma's 18 and tougher than both of us put together, he said, though he couldn't quite keep the worry out of his voice. Besides, she's going to Colombia in a few months. She'll be safe there. You hope. I know. Ethan turned to face her fully. Isabella, I'm not walking away from this. I'm not walking away from you. Not again. She stared at him for a long moment, searching his face. Why are you willing to risk everything for someone who walked out of your life 10 years ago? It was a fair question, and one he'd been asking himself since the moment she'd whispered those 6 words in the restaurant. Why was he willing to throw himself into her war? Why was he ready to put his daughter, his business, his entire life on the line for a woman who'd chosen duty over love a decade ago? Because, he said, stepping closer to her, 10 years ago I let fear make my decisions for me. I let my father's voice in my head convince me that I wasn't good enough for you, that I'd only hold you back. I walked away because I thought it was the noble thing to do. Ethan, I'm not done. His voice was gentle but firm. I spent 10 years regretting that decision. 10 years wondering what would have happened if I'd fought for you instead of just accepting defeat. I'm not making that mistake again. Isabella's eyes were bright with unshed tears. What if we can't win? What if Victor destroys both of us? Then we go down fighting. Ethan reached up and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had started to fall. But we go down together. For a moment they just stood there looking at each other in the dim light from the city below. Then Isabella rose up on her toes and kissed him. It was supposed to be soft, gentle, a mere brush of lips. But the moment they touched, 10 years of suppressed longing exploded between them. Ethan's arms came around her, pulling her against him, and Isabella melted into his embrace like she'd been waiting her whole life for this moment. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. "I've missed you," Isabella whispered against his lips. "God, I've missed you so much." "I've missed you too." Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "Every single day." They might have stood there forever, lost in each other, if Isabella's phone hadn't buzzed loudly from her purse. She pulled back reluctantly, glancing at the screen. "It's my assistant," she said, frowning. She wouldn't call this late unless it was important. "Take it." Isabella answered the phone, and Ethan watched her expression change from confusion to alarm. "What do you mean the files are gone?" she said into the phone. "All of them. When did this happen?" Ethan couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but he could see the color draining from Isabella's face. "No, don't call building security. Don't call anyone." Isabella's voice was tight with control. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. She hung up and turned to Ethan, her eyes wide with something that looked like panic. "Someone broke into my office tonight," she said. "All my files on the Seattle project are gone. The financial records, the security footage, the email backups, everything." Ethan felt ice settle in his stomach. "Victor. It has to be. But how did he know? How did he know I had evidence against him? Maybe he's been watching you longer than you thought. Maybe he has someone inside your company feeding him information." Isabella sank onto the couch, her head in her hands. "He's always one step ahead. Always." "Not always." Ethan sat beside her, his mind already working. "He made a mistake tonight." "What mistake?" "He showed his hand too early. If he'd waited, let you present your evidence and then discredited it, he could have made you look like a desperate woman making false accusations. But by stealing the files, he's confirmed that there was something worth stealing. That doesn't help us if we can't prove he took them." "Maybe we can." Ethan pulled out his phone. "You said there was security footage of him in your office during off hours. What about tonight? What about right now?" Isabella's head snapped up. "The building has cameras everywhere. If Victor was there tonight, then we've got him on tape breaking and entering. But the security company reports to the building management, and building management reports to, let me guess, someone Victor has connections with." The head of security is his golf buddy. Ethan was quiet for a moment, thinking. What about your assistant? The one who called you? Is she trustworthy? Sarah, absolutely. She's been with me for 5 years, but she's probably long gone by now. Call her back. Tell her to go back to the office and wait for us. Ethan, if Victor's people are still there, then we need to know about it. Ethan stood pacing to the windows and back. Isabella, we're not going to beat Victor by playing defense. We need to start making moves of our own, such as showing up at your office right now while whoever broke in might still be there, such as demanding to see the security footage from tonight, such as making it clear that we're not going away quietly. Isabella stared at him. That's incredibly dangerous. Yes, it is. Victor could have us killed and make it look like an accident. He could try. You're insane. Probably. Ethan turned back to her with a grin that was equal parts charm and recklessness. But I'm your husband, remember? And husbands protect their wives. Isabella looked at him for a long moment, and he saw the exact instant when she made her decision. Her spine straightened, her chin lifted, and suddenly she was every inch the CEO who'd built a business empire from her father's modest construction company. Okay, she said, standing. Let's go to war. They took Ethan's truck partly because it was less conspicuous than Isabella's sedan, but mostly because neither of them trusted her driver not to report their movements to someone who might report them to Victor. The Grant Industries building was in Midtown, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that scraped the belly of the clouds. Impressive, Ethan said as they pulled into the parking garage. My father designed it, Isabella said, her voice soft with memory. He said he wanted to build something that would last for generations. It will. Not if Victor gets his hands on it. They rode the elevator to the 40th floor in tense silence. The building felt eerily quiet after hours, their footsteps echoing on the marble floors as they walked toward Isabella's corner office. Ms. Grant. A young woman with short red hair hurried toward them, relief evident on her face. Thank God you're here. I've been calling building security, but they keep putting me on hold. Sarah, this is my husband, Ethan, Isabella said smoothly. Ethan, my assistant, Sarah Chen. Sarah's eyes widened slightly, clearly. This was the first she was hearing about Isabella's marriage, but she recovered quickly. Mr. Grant, she said, offering Ethan her hand. Nice to meet you. Ethan shook her hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze. Likewise. What exactly happened here tonight? I stayed late to finish the quarterly reports, Sarah explained as they walked toward Isabella's office. I left around 9:30, but I forgot my phone, so I came back around 10. The office door was open, and there were people inside. People? Isabella asked. How many? Well, 3, maybe 4. They scattered when they saw me, but not before I got a good look at one of them. Did you recognize him? Sarah hesitated. I think so. He looked like the man from the photos in the divorce files. Your ex-husband. Ethan felt Isabella tense beside him. Victor was here personally. I think so. But I can't be sure. The lighting was dim and I was pretty shaken up. They reached Isabella's office and Ethan's jaw tightened. The place had been thoroughly searched. Desk drawers were open, filing cabinets had been rifled through, and papers were scattered across the floor. Professional job, he said, taking in the controlled chaos. They knew what they were looking for. My safe, Isabella said, rushing to a painting behind her desk. She swung it open to reveal a small wall safe, its door hanging open. Everything's gone. All the backup drives, the printed files, the recording I made of Victor. The recording you said wasn't admissible in court. It wasn't admissible, but it was damning. Victor basically confessed to setting up the whole scheme. Ethan walked around the office, noting details. Sarah, you said building security put you on hold for over an hour. I kept calling, but they said they'd send someone up when they had a chance. That's not protocol, Isabella said grimly. Building security should have responded immediately to a break-in report. Unless they were told not to, Ethan said. Unless someone higher up the food chain told them to look the other way for a few hours. Isabella sank into her desk chair, looking defeated. He's won. Without that evidence, I have nothing to fight back with. Actually, Sarah said quietly, that's not entirely true. Both Ethan and Isabella turned to look at her. I may have made a small backup of some files before I left tonight. Sarah continued, her voice careful. Call it paranoia, but given everything that's been happening with the Seattle project, I thought it might be wise to have copies of certain documents stored off-site. Isabella's eyes widened. What kind of documents? Financial records, email chains, some of the security footage you asked me to compile last week. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a small external drive. It's not everything, but it's something. Ethan felt hope spark in his chest. Sarah, you might have just saved both our lives. There's more, Sarah said, glancing nervously at Isabella. I've been doing some digging on my own time, and I found some interesting connections between Mr. Hale's consulting firm and some of the contractors on the Seattle project. What kind of connections? The kind that suggest he's been planning this for a lot longer than we thought. Sarah pulled out a folder. Mr. Hale's firm has been making payments to at least 3 of the contractors involved in the Seattle project. Small payments spread out over time, but they coincide with the periods when funds went missing. Isabella leaned forward. You're saying he's been paying the contractors to skim money and blame it on me? That's exactly what I'm saying, and I think I can prove it. Ethan looked between the two women, feeling the first stirring of real hope since this nightmare had begun. What do you need from us? He asked. Time, Sarah said, and probably a good lawyer. If we're going to take on Victor Hale, we need to be absolutely certain we have enough evidence to bury him. One shot is all we'll get. How long do you think we have before Victor makes his move? Isabella asked. Based on tonight, not long. Sarah gathered her papers. I'd guess he'll call an emergency board meeting within the next few days. Strike while you're still reeling from the break-in. Then we work fast. Ethan looked at Isabella. Can you trust your board, any of them? Some of them. My father's old friends mostly. But Victor's been cultivating relationships there for years. What about the press? Any investigative journalists who might be interested in a story about corporate sabotage? Isabella's eyes lit up. Actually, yes. There's a reporter at the Wall Street Journal who's been sniffing around Victor's business practices for months. I've been feeding her information anonymously. Then we give her the story of a lifetime, Ethan said. Victor wanted to play dirty. Let's show him what dirty really looks like. Sarah was gathering up the scattered papers from Isabella's office, sorting them into piles. There's something else you should know, she said without looking up. I've been getting calls at home. Hang-ups mostly, but also some threatening messages. Isabella went pale. Sarah, why didn't you tell me? Because I wasn't sure they were connected to this until tonight. But now, she held up her phone. I recorded the last one. The caller said, I should be careful about working late because accidents happen to people who don't mind their own business. Ethan felt cold fury wash over him. Victor's escalating. He's not just going after Isabella anymore. He's targeting anyone who might help her. which means all of us are in danger, Isabella said quietly. They looked at each other in the dim light of the ransacked office, the weight of their situation settling around them like a shroud. Victor Hale wasn't just a corporate predator, he was a man who was willing to use violence and intimidation to get what he wanted. And he'd made it clear that anyone who stood in his way was fair game. "So what do we do?" Sarah asked. Ethan looked at Isabella, seeing his own determination reflected in her green eyes. "We do what we came here to do," he said. "We gather our evidence, we build our case, and we take the bastard down." "Together," Isabella added, reaching for his hand. "Together," he agreed. Outside, the city hummed with its eternal energy, unaware that in a glass tower high above the streets, 3 people had just declared war on one of the most dangerous men in New York. And somewhere in the darkness, Victor Hale was planning his next move, in a game where the stakes kept getting higher and the rules kept changing. But for the first time in years, Isabella Grant wasn't facing the fight alone. And that Ethan thought as he squeezed her hand might just make all the difference. The clock on Isabella's office wall showed 2:47 a.m. when they finally finished sorting through the scattered documents and copying everything onto Sarah's backup drives. The building had grown even quieter, if that was possible, and every small sound, the hum of the ventilation system, the distant ping of an elevator, seemed amplified in the darkness. "That's everything we can salvage," Sarah said, closing her laptop with a soft click. "I'll need a few days to analyze all the financial data, but what we have here should be enough to start building a case." Isabella rubbed her temples, exhaustion etched in every line of her face. "What about the security footage from tonight? Can we get access to that?" "Not through normal channels," Sarah replied. "But I might know someone who could help us get around the official gatekeepers." Ethan looked up from the papers he'd been reviewing. "What kind of someone?" "A friend in the IT department. Someone who owes me a favor and doesn't particularly like the current security chief." Sarah's smile was enigmatic. "Sometimes it pays to be nice to the people everyone else ignores." "Can you trust him?" Isabella asked. "Her. And yes, I think so, but we should move fast. If Victor realizes we were here tonight, he'll want to scrub any evidence of his visit." As if summoned by their conversation, Isabella's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at the screen and went pale. "What is it?" Ethan asked, moving to look over her shoulder. "It's from Victor." Isabella's voice was barely a whisper. "He says he knows we were here tonight, and he wants to meet." Ethan read the message over her shoulder, his jaw tightening with each word. "My dear Isabella, understand you and your new husband had quite the evening adventure. Perhaps it's time we discussed the situation like civilized adults. Tomorrow noon, the Mandarin Oriental. Don't disappoint me." "He's not even trying to hide it anymore," Sarah said, looking at the message. "He's basically admitting he was here." "Because he thinks he's untouchable," Isabella replied, her voice growing stronger. "Because he believes he's already won." Ethan was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Maybe we let him think that." "What do you mean?" "I mean maybe we take this meeting. Maybe we let Victor think he's backed us into a corner and we use that overconfidence against him." Isabella stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Ethan walking into a meeting with Victor when he's feeling cornered is like walking into a cage with a wounded lion. Not if we're prepared. Not if we have backup plans and exit strategies. Ethan began pacing his mind, working through possibilities. "Think about it, Isabella. Victor's used to intimidating people in private, using his wealth and connections to bully them into submission. But what if this time the conversation wasn't private?" Sarah caught on first. "You want to record the meeting?" "I want to do more than that. I want to get Victor to confess on tape in a recording that will be admissible in court this time." "How?" Isabella asked. "By making him think he's won. By going to that meeting and letting him gloat, letting him spell out exactly how he orchestrated this whole scheme." Ethan stopped pacing and turned to face them both. Men like Victor can't resist explaining how clever they are, especially when they think their victim is helpless. "It's dangerous," Isabella said. "If he realizes what we're doing, then we make sure he doesn't realize it." Ethan sat down across from her, taking her hands in his. "Isabella, this is our chance. Victor's asking us to come to him on his terms in a public place. He's confident enough that he's not worried about witnesses or recordings. That confidence could be his downfall." Isabella was quiet for a long moment, staring at their joined hands. When she looked up, there was something fierce in her eyes. "Okay," she said, "but we do this smart. We plan for every contingency." "Agreed." Sarah cleared her throat. "Actually, I might have an idea about that." They both turned to look at her. "My cousin works for a private security firm. They do corporate espionage, anti-terrorism consulting, that sort of thing. Very discreet, very professional." Sarah pulled out her phone. "If anyone would know how to wire someone for a meeting like this without getting caught, it would be them." "Can we trust them?" Ethan asked. "My cousin Danny, he's family, and he hates bullies almost as much as I do." Isabella stood and walked to the windows, looking out at the city below. Dawn was still hours away, but the streets were never truly empty in New York. Even now, there were people down there, cab drivers, nurses, ending their shifts, insomniacs, walking off restless energy. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that 40 floors above them, 3 people were planning something that could change everything. "If we do this," she said without turning around, "there's no going back. Once we make a move against Victor, he'll escalate. He'll use every dirty trick, every connection, every threat at his disposal." "He's already escalating," Ethan pointed out. "The break-in tonight, the threats against Sarah, he's past the point of playing nice." "I know." Isabella turned back to them. "I'm just making sure you both understand what you're signing up for. Victor doesn't lose gracefully." "Neither do we," Sarah said firmly. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you've been fighting this battle alone for too long. You don't have to carry this weight by yourself anymore." Isabella's eyes grew bright with emotion. "Sarah, no, let me finish." Sarah stood, her small frame radiating determination. "I've worked for you for 5 years. I've seen you rebuild this company from the damage Victor did during your marriage. I've watched you work 18-hour days trying to protect the jobs of thousands of employees. And I've seen what this stress has done to you." "What do you mean, Fadto?" "I mean you've forgotten how to trust people. You've forgotten that you don't have to face every crisis alone." Sarah glanced at Ethan. "But tonight, watching you two together, I saw something I haven't seen in years." "What?" "I saw you remember how to hope." The words hung in the air between them, simple but powerful. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of truth he hadn't wanted to acknowledge. "Sarah's right," he said quietly. "Isabella, you've been fighting this war like you're the only soldier in the army. But you're not alone anymore." Isabella looked between them, and for a moment her carefully maintained composure cracked. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I'm scared that if I let myself count on you, if I let myself believe we can win this, and then we lose, I don't think I could survive that." Ethan stood and crossed to her, taking her face in his hands. "Then we don't lose. It's not that simple." "Yes, it is." His voice was gentle but absolutely certain. Isabella, 10 years ago, I walked away because I was afraid of not being enough for you. I'm not walking away again. Whatever happens, we face it together. She searched his eyes, looking for doubt, for the fear that had driven him apart before. But all she saw was steady determination and something deeper, something that made her heart race. Okay, she said finally. We do this. All of us. Sarah grinned. Good. Because I already texted my cousin. He's meeting us at his office in 2 hours. Danny Chen turned out to be a compact man in his early 30s, with intelligent eyes and the kind of calm competence that suggested he'd seen everything and wasn't impressed by much. His office was in a nondescript building in Queens, the kind of place that looked like it might house an accounting firm or a small law practice. Izzy tells me you need some help with a delicate situation, he said, pouring coffee from a pot that looked like it had seen better decades. She also mentioned something about corporate espionage and possible violence. That's a fair summary, Ethan said, accepting the coffee gratefully. The caffeine was a necessity at this point. None of them had slept, and the day ahead promised to be challenging. Tell me about the target. Isabella gave Danny a concise rundown of the situation from her marriage to Victor through the current crisis. Danny listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. Victor Hale, he said when she finished. I've heard of him. Not a nice man from what I understand. That's putting it mildly, Sarah muttered. The question is, what exactly are you hoping to accomplish with this meeting? Danny set down his pen and looked at them seriously. Because if you're just looking to gather intelligence, that's one thing. But if you're hoping to get him to confess to a felony on tape, that's considerably more complicated. We need the confession, Isabella said. Without it, all we have is circumstantial evidence and theories. Victor's too smart and too well connected to go down for anything less than a smoking gun. And you think he'll confess if he believes he's won? I think Victor can't resist explaining how clever he is, Ethan said, especially to an audience he thinks is powerless to stop him. Danny was quiet for a moment, thinking. It's risky. If he realizes you're recording him, things could turn ugly very quickly. Can you help us or not? Isabella asked. Danny's smile was slight but confident. Oh, I can help you. The question is whether you're prepared for what comes after. What do you mean? I mean that if we get Victor Hale confessing to corporate sabotage and fraud on tape, he's going to know exactly where that recording came from. He'll come after all of you with everything he has. He's already doing that, Sarah pointed out. Fair point. Danny stood and walked to a safe in the corner of his office. In that case, let's make sure you're prepared for war. The next hour was a crash course in surveillance technology and personal protection. Danny showed them recording devices so small they were virtually undetectable, explained how to position themselves to get the clearest audio, and outlined escape routes from the Mandarin Oriental. The most important thing, he said, as he fitted Isabella with a wire so sophisticated it looked like a piece of jewelry, is to stay calm. Victor's going to try to provoke you to make you emotional and reactive. Don't give him the satisfaction. What if he gets suspicious? Ethan asked. Then you abort. No recording is worth your life. Danny's expression was serious. I mean that. If anything feels wrong, if Victor seems like he's on to you, you get out of there immediately. And if he won't let us leave, Danny handed Ethan a small device that looked like a pen. Press the button on the side twice. It sends an alert to my team. We'll have people positioned around the hotel, and we can be in that room in under 60 seconds. Isabella took a shaky breath. This is really happening. Second thoughts, Ethan asked gently. No, just processing. She looked at him with eyes that held a mixture of fear and determination. 10 years ago, the biggest risk I took was wearing white shoes after Labor Day. Now I'm about to confront my sociopathic ex-husband while wearing a wire. 10 years ago, you didn't have backup, Sarah pointed out. 10 years ago, I didn't have you, Isabella said, looking at Ethan. Either of you. The weight of her words settled around them like a promise. Whatever happened in the next few hours, they would face it together. By the time they left Danny's office, the sun was climbing toward its zenith, and the city was alive with the energy of a new day. People hurried along the sidewalks, absorbed in their own dramas and deadlines, unaware that in a few hours, the fate of one of the city's largest corporations would be decided in a hotel room 30 floors above their heads. I should go home and change, Isabella said, as they stood on the sidewalk outside Danny's building. If I'm going to face Victor, I want to look like the CEO he's trying to destroy. I'll come with you, Ethan said automatically. Ethan, you don't have to. Yes, I do. His voice was firm. We're in this together. Remember, that includes the parts where we're scared and need support. Isabella looked like she wanted to argue, then nodded. Okay. But I warn you, my morning routine is not exactly exciting. As it turned out, watching Isabella Grant prepare for battle was one of the most intimate things Ethan had ever experienced. She moved through her apartment with quiet efficiency, selecting clothes with the same precision she might use to choose weapons. The black suit was armor, the heels were confidence, the minimal jewelry was power, distilled to its essence. How do I look? She asked, turning to face him. Like a woman who's about to take down a predator, Ethan said, and meant it. The exhausted, frightened woman from the night before had been replaced by someone who looked like she could command armies. Good. Isabella checked her reflection one more time, then turned to him. Ethan, I need you to know something. What? If this goes wrong, if Victor somehow turns this around on us, I don't want you to blame yourself. You didn't ask for this fight. Neither did you. Yes, I did. The moment I married him, I asked for it. The moment I ignored the warning signs because I was lonely and grieving, I set all of this in motion. Ethan crossed the room and took her hands. Isabella, listen to me. Victor Hale is a predator. Predators don't create their victims, they find them. You were vulnerable because you'd lost your father and you were trying to run a company while dealing with grief. That doesn't make any of this your fault. Doesn't it? No, it makes you human. Ethan's voice was gentle but firm. And it makes Victor a monster who took advantage of someone in pain. There's a difference. Isabella stared at him for a long moment, then stood on her toes and kissed him softly. Thank you. For what? For seeing me as human instead of just a collection of mistakes. The ride to the Mandarin Oriental was tense but quiet. They'd agreed that Ethan would accompany Isabella to the meeting. After all, they were supposed to be married, and a devoted husband wouldn't let his wife face a threat alone. Sarah would wait in the lobby, with Danny's team ready to coordinate if things went wrong. Remember, Ethan said, as they pulled up to the hotel. The goal is to get him talking. Let him think he's won, let him gloat, and let him explain exactly how he did it. And if he gets violent, then we get out. The recording isn't worth our lives. Isabella nodded, touching the nearly invisible wire Danny had positioned at her collarbone. Okay, let's go end this. The Mandarin Oriental's lobby was elegantly understated, all marble and soft lighting, and the kind of quiet luxury that whispered rather than shouted about money. Victor had chosen the location well public enough that outright violence would be difficult, but private enough for frank conversation. Mr. and Mrs. Grant. The concierge's smile was professionally warm. Mr. Hale is expecting you. The penthouse suite. Of course it was the penthouse. Victor never did anything halfway. The elevator ride felt like it lasted forever and no time at all. Ethan found himself studying Isabella's profile, memorizing the determined set of her jaw and the way her hands were perfectly steady despite everything. She was magnificent, he realized. Absolutely magnificent. Whatever happens, he said quietly, as the elevator climbed toward the 50th floor. I'm proud of you. We haven't done anything yet. You've survived. You've fought back. You've refused to let him break you. Ethan reached for her hand. That's everything. The elevator chimed softly, and the doors opened to reveal a hallway carpeted in deep burgundy. At the far end, a single door stood slightly ajar. Showtime, Isabella murmured, and they walked forward together to face whatever waited on the other side. Victor Hale stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse suite, his back to them as they entered. He was perfectly dressed, as always, his silver hair gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. The room around him was opulent but cold, much like the man himself. Isabella, he said without turning around. And the mysterious Mr. Cole. How lovely that you could join me. Cut the pleasantries, Victor, Isabella said, her voice steady. What do you want? Straight to the point. I always admired that about you. Victor turned, then his pale eyes taking in both of them with calculating interest. Though I must say your taste in husbands has certainly evolved. Ethan felt Isabella tense beside him, but she didn't rise to the bait. You said you wanted to discuss the situation. Indeed I do. Victor gestured to a seating area arranged around a low table. Please sit. Can I offer you anything? Coffee, wine? Something stronger? I imagine you've had quite the eventful 24 hours. They sat on the sofa, maintaining the careful distance of a couple still finding their way back to each other, while Victor took the chair across from them. The positioning was deliberate. Ethan realized Victor wanted to be able to see both their faces to gauge their reactions. Now then, Victor said, settling back in his chair with the satisfaction of a cat who'd cornered a mouse, let's discuss your recent nocturnal adventures. I don't know what you mean, Isabella said. Victor's laugh was cold. Please, my dear, we're all adults here. I know you were at the office last night. I know you discovered that certain files had gone missing. And I know you're here because you've realized the precarious nature of your situation. Are you confessing to breaking and entering? Ethan asked mildly. I'm confessing to nothing more than a keen interest in my ex-wife's well-being. Victor's smile was razor-sharp. Though I will say, Isabella, I'm disappointed in your security protocols. A company of Grant Industries' stature should really invest in better protection for sensitive documents. Isabella's hands clenched in her lap, but her voice remained level. What do you want, Victor? What I've always wanted. What's best for the company? Victor leaned forward, his eyes bright with something that might have been excitement. Isabella, you've done admirable work rebuilding Grant Industries after your father's death. Truly admirable. But let's be honest, you're in over your head. The company's stock price would suggest otherwise. Stock prices are ephemeral things, my dear. Public perception, regulatory investigations, criminal charges, these have a way of affecting market confidence in ways that quarterly earnings simply cannot overcome. There it was, the threat delivered with the smooth confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. Are you threatening me? Isabella asked. I'm offering you an alternative. Victor stood and walked to a briefcase that sat on the room's dining table. He withdrew a thick folder and returned to his seat. A generous buyout offer for your shares in Grant Industries. More than generous, actually. Enough to ensure that you and your new husband can live very comfortably for the rest of your lives. In exchange for your resignation as CEO, a public statement acknowledging certain irregularities in the company's recent projects, a smooth transition of power to a more experienced leadership team. Ethan watched Victor's face as he spoke, noting the way his eyes gleamed with satisfaction. This was what the man lived for the moment, when his victim realized they were beaten, when they had no choice but to accept his terms. "And if I refuse?" Isabella asked. Victor's smile grew wider. "Well, that would be unfortunate. You see, the irregularities in the Seattle project are quite extensive. Missing funds, forged documents, authorization codes used inappropriately. The kind of thing that could result in very serious charges being filed." Charges against who? Against whoever was responsible, naturally. Though I imagine the investigation would be quite thorough, quite public. The kind of media attention that tends to destroy reputations and careers. Isabella was quiet for a moment, and Ethan could feel the tension radiating from her. This was the moment Danny had warned them about, when Victor would push hardest, when he would try to break her down completely. "You orchestrated the whole thing," she said finally. It wasn't a question. Victor's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "My dear Isabella, I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating a fact. You systematically embezzled money from the Seattle project and created a paper trail that leads back to me. You've spent 2 years setting up this scenario, waiting for the right moment to spring your trap. That's quite an accusation. Do you have any proof of these allegations?" "Not anymore. Funny how evidence tends to disappear right when you need it most." Victor chuckled, a sound like ice cracking. "Evidence is such a fragile thing, isn't it? Files can be corrupted, hard drives can fail, witnesses can become unreliable. It's amazing how often important documents simply vanish." Ethan felt a surge of hope. Victor was talking, explaining his methods with the smug satisfaction of a man who believed himself beyond consequences. "Keep going," he thought. "Keep talking." "You're very thorough," Isabella said. "I'll give you that. I've always believed in attention to detail. It's what separates the successful from the merely ambitious." Victor leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying himself. "Take your marriage, for instance. 3 years of careful cultivation, patient courtship, strategic positioning. By the time I proposed, you practically begged me to save you from the burden of running the company alone." "Is that what you tell yourself, that I begged for your help? Didn't you?" "You were drowning, my dear. Overwhelmed by grief and responsibility, making emotional decisions that would have bankrupted the company within 5 years. I offered stability, experience, a steady hand to guide Grant Industries into the future. You offered control. I offered partnership. You chose to see it as imprisonment." Victor's voice hardened slightly. "Just as you're choosing to see this current situation as persecution rather than opportunity." Isabella stood abruptly, and for a moment Ethan thought she was going to walk out. Instead, she moved to the windows, staring out at the city below. "You killed my father," she said quietly. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Ethan felt his breath catch, and he saw Victor's mask slip for just an instant before sliding back into place. "That's a very serious accusation, Isabella, and a very foolish one. Is it because I've been thinking about the timing? How convenient it was that Daddy died right when you were positioning yourself as my savior. How his car accident happened on a stretch of road he'd driven thousands of times. Your father was an old man, with failing reflexes, who insisted on driving himself despite his family's concerns. His death was tragic, but hardly surprising. His death was murder. Isabella turned back to face Victor, her eyes blazing with fury and pain. You killed him because he was starting to ask questions about you, starting to investigate your background, your finances, your convenient appearance in my life, right when I was most vulnerable. You're hysterical, Victor said, but Ethan caught the slight tremor in his voice. Am I? Or am I finally seeing you clearly for the first time? Isabella took a step toward him, her voice growing stronger. You're a predator, Victor. You find wealthy women who are isolated and vulnerable, you marry them, you gain control of their assets, and then you destroy them when they're no longer useful. That's enough. Victor stood, his composure finally cracking. You're overwrought, Isabella. Grief and stress have clearly affected your judgment. Have they? Then explain to me how you knew exactly which contractors to approach for the Seattle project. Explain how you had access to authorization codes that I changed after our divorce. Explain how you managed to forge my signature so perfectly that even handwriting experts would be fooled. Victor was silent for a long moment, his pale eyes fixed on Isabella's face. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet. You always were too smart for your own good. Smart enough to record this conversation, Isabella said, her hand moving to the wire at her throat. Victor's face went white, then flushed dark red. You little, I wouldn't finish that sentence if I were you, Ethan said, standing and moving to Isabella's side. Not unless you want to add threatening language to the list of crimes you've just confessed to. Victor's laugh was harsh and bitter. Crimes? What crimes? You have nothing but the ramblings of a grieving daughter who can't accept that her father died in an accident. We have you confessing to embezzlement and fraud, Isabella said calmly. We have you describing in detail how you manipulated me and stole from my company. And we have you admitting that evidence has a way of disappearing when it's inconvenient for you. You have nothing that would hold up in court. Maybe not, Ethan said, but we have enough to destroy your reputation and bring law enforcement attention you really don't want. Victor stared at them both, his composure completely shattered now. The smooth, sophisticated mask had fallen away, revealing something cold and vicious underneath. You think you've won, he said finally. You think this changes anything, but you have no idea who you're dealing with. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Isabella replied. A small, pathetic man who preys on women because he's too weak to succeed on his own merit. The insult hit home. Victor's face contorted with rage, and for a moment Ethan thought the man might actually attack them physically. Instead, he reached into his jacket. I wouldn't. Danny Chen's voice came from the doorway, calm and professional. He stood there with two other men, all of them wearing the kind of alert competence that suggested military or law enforcement backgrounds. Mr. Hale, I'd recommend keeping your hands where we can see them. Victor froze his hand halfway to whatever he'd been reaching for. Who the hell are you? Private security, Danny said simply. Hired by Mr. and Mrs. Cole to ensure their safety during this meeting. Cole? Victor's eyes snapped back to Isabella and Ethan. Your name isn't Grant? No, Ethan said with satisfaction. It's Cole. Isabella Cole as of this morning. We were married by a judge friend of mine while you were busy breaking into her office. The lie came easily, and it had the desired effect. Victor's face went through a series of expressions, confusion, rage, and finally calculation. You think marriage will protect you? You think changing your name will make any difference? I think having backup and recording equipment will make a difference, Isabella said, along with the evidence we've already gathered and the investigative journalist who's been waiting for exactly this kind of story. Victor was quiet for a long moment, his brilliant mind clearly working through scenarios and escape routes. When he spoke again, his voice had regained some of its earlier smoothness. "Very clever, my dear. Very clever indeed. But you've made one crucial error." "What's that?" Victor's smile was cold as winter. "You've assumed that I'm working alone." As if summoned by his words, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. Multiple sets of footsteps moving with purpose toward the penthouse suite. Danny's hand moved to his jacket, and his two companions shifted position, blocking the exits. But Victor's smile only grew wider. "You see, Isabella, I've been planning this conversation for quite some time, and I've taken certain precautions to ensure that it concludes in a manner favorable to my interests." The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and Ethan felt ice settle in his stomach. Whatever was about to happen, Victor had orchestrated it, and judging by the man's confidence, it wasn't going to end well for them. "What do you want?" Isabella asked, her voice steady, despite the fear Ethan could see in her eyes. "What I've always wanted," Victor replied. "Everything." The door to the penthouse suite burst open with a violence that made everyone in the room freeze. But instead of Victor's reinforcements, 3 men in NYPD windbreakers stormed through the entrance, weapons drawn, and voices sharp with authority. "NYPD! Everyone on the ground, now!" Danny's hand moved away from his jacket in a gesture of compliance, and his team immediately identified themselves as private security with proper licensing. The lead detective, a graying man with intelligent eyes, surveyed the room with the practiced gaze of someone who'd walked into plenty of tense situations. "Detective Rodriguez, Major Crimes," he announced. "We received a report of a potential kidnapping and extortion in progress." Victor's face went through a fascinating series of expressions: surprise, calculation, and finally, smug satisfaction. "Officers, thank God you're here. These people have been threatening me, trying to extort money from me with false accusations and fabricated recordings." Ethan felt Isabella's hand slip into his, her fingers, cold but steady. This was Victor's backup plan, he realized. When manipulation failed, the man fell back on his connections within the system. "Is that so?" Detective Rodriguez looked between Victor and the rest of them. "And you are Victor Hale. I'm sure you're familiar with my work on the Police Benevolent Association's fundraising committee." The name drop was subtle but effective. Rodriguez's expression shifted slightly, becoming more deferential. "Mr. Hale, can you explain what's happening here?" "These people lured me here under false pretenses," Victor said, his voice taking on the tone of a concerned citizen. "They've been making wild accusations about business dealings, claiming I'm involved in some sort of corporate conspiracy. When I tried to leave, they blocked the exits." "That's not true," Isabella said firmly. "Mr. Hale requested this meeting. We have text messages proving Miss..." Rodriguez looked at her expectantly. "Grant. Isabella Grant, CEO of Grant Industries." "Ms. Grant claims you requested this meeting, Mr. Hale." Victor's smile was perfectly calibrated, concerned, but understanding. "Detective, I'm afraid Ms. Grant has been under tremendous stress lately. There have been some irregularities in her company's finances, and I suspect the pressure has affected her judgment. I came here as a favor to her late father, hoping to help her see reason before she makes accusations that could destroy her career." Ethan watched the detective's face, seeing the moment when Rodriguez began to buy Victor's version of events. The man was good. He played the role of the concerned family friend perfectly, just worried enough to be credible, just authoritative enough to command respect. "Officer," Danny interjected quietly. "I'm Daniel Chen, licensed private investigator and security consultant. My clients asked me to be present during this meeting, because they had concerns about Mr. Hale's intentions. What kind of concerns? The kind that led them to record this conversation for their own protection. Victor's expression darkened. You see, they admit to recording me without my consent. In New York State, that's a felony. Actually, Isabella said, reaching into her purse. In New York, only one party needs to consent to recording a conversation. And I consented to recording my own conversation. She held up her phone, which had been recording the entire exchange in addition to the sophisticated equipment Danny had provided. Everything Mr. Hale said is on here, including his confession to embezzling funds from my company. Rodriguez looked between them clearly, trying to assess who was telling the truth. I'm going to need all of you to come to the station and make formal statements. Of course, Victor said immediately. I'm happy to cooperate fully with any investigation. As are we, Isabella added. But I think you should know that Mr. Hale just confessed to corporate fraud and implied involvement in my father's death. That's enough. Victor's composure finally cracked completely. This woman is delusional. Her father died in a car accident 3 years ago. There was a full investigation. An investigation that you had influence over, Isabella shot back. Just like you're trying to influence this situation now. Detective Rodriguez held up his hands. Everyone calm down. Mr. Hale, you mentioned irregularities in Ms. Grant's company finances. Do you have evidence of wrongdoing? I have extensive documentation, Victor replied smoothly. Financial records showing millions of dollars in missing funds authorization codes, used inappropriately forged signatures. Ms. Grant has been systematically embezzling from her own company. Those records are fabricated, Isabella said, and we can prove it. How? Sarah Chen stepped forward from where she'd been standing quietly near the windows. Because I have the real financial records, along with evidence showing how the fake ones were created. Victor's face went white. Who is this person? This is Sarah Chen, my assistant, Isabella said. And she's been conducting her own investigation into the discrepancies in our Seattle project. Sarah pulled out a tablet and handed it to Detective Rodriguez. These are bank records showing payments from Victor Hale's consulting firm to contractors involved in the Seattle project. The payments coincide exactly with periods when funds went missing from Grant Industries' accounts. Rodriguez scrolled through the documents, his expression growing more interested. Mr. Hale, can you explain these payments? Legitimate consulting fees, Victor said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. My firm provided advisory services to several contractors in the Seattle area. Advisory services that you didn't disclose during your divorce proceedings, Isabella added. Advisory services that created conflicts of interest with your position at Grant Industries. That's not relevant. It's extremely relevant, Sarah interrupted, pulling up another document on her tablet. Because the consulting agreements were backdated. They were created after the divorce but made to look like they'd been in place for years. Detective Rodriguez looked up from the tablet. Mr. Hale, these are serious allegations. Do you have documentation for these consulting agreements? For the first time since the police had arrived, Victor looked genuinely rattled. My lawyers have all the relevant paperwork. We'd like to see that paperwork, Rodriguez said, along with any other documentation related to your business dealings with Grant Industries contractors. This is harassment, Victor said, his voice rising. These people have orchestrated an elaborate frame job and you're playing right into their hands. Then let's hear the recording, Rodriguez said pragmatically. If they're lying, the evidence will speak for itself. Isabella looked at Danny, who nodded slightly. She pulled out her phone and hit play. Victor's voice filled the room, smooth and confident. Evidence is such a fragile thing, isn't it? Files can be corrupted, hard drives can fail, witnesses can become unreliable. It's amazing how often important documents simply vanish. The detective's eyebrows rose. Mr. Hale, this sounds like you're describing how to destroy evidence. That's taken out of context, Victor said quickly. I was speaking hypothetically about the challenges of maintaining digital records. The recording continued, Victor's voice becoming more boastful. 3 years of careful cultivation, patient courtship, strategic positioning. By the time I proposed, you practically begged me to save you from the burden of running the company alone. This sounds like you're describing a calculated plan to gain control of Ms. Grant's company, Rodriguez observed. It's not what it sounds like. But the most damning part was yet to come. Isabella's voice on the recording, "You killed my father." And Victor's response, "Your father was an old man with failing reflexes," followed by Isabella's accusation about murder, and Victor's reply, "You always were too smart for your own good." The room fell silent when the recording ended. Detective Rodriguez looked at Victor with new eyes, the deference gone, replaced by the sharp attention of a cop who just heard a suspect make some very incriminating statements. "Mr. Hale," Rodriguez said carefully, "I think we need to have a longer conversation. Downtown." "This is ridiculous," Victor sputtered. "You can't arrest me based on a conversation taken out of context by a vindictive ex-wife. Actually, I can arrest you based on probable cause, which this recording certainly provides." Rodriguez gestured to his officers. "Mr. Hale, you're under arrest for suspicion of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent." As the Miranda rights continued, Ethan watched Victor's face cycle through disbelief, rage, and finally, cold calculation. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Men like Victor didn't go down easily, and they certainly didn't go down quietly. "This won't stick," Victor said, as the officers moved to cuff him. "I have the best lawyers in the city. I'll be out in hours, and then we'll see who's really guilty here." "Maybe," Isabella said quietly, "but at least now everyone will be watching, including the media." Victor's eyes snapped to her face. "What media?" Sarah held up her own phone. "The media that's been live streaming this entire conversation to my cousin's secure server. The media that's already received copies of all our evidence. The media that's going to be very interested in this story." For the first time since Ethan had met him, Victor Hale looked genuinely afraid. "You can't," Victor started, then stopped. "This is illegal surveillance. Recording without consent, harassment, entrapment." "One-party consent recording in a public space," Danny said calmly. "All perfectly legal, Mr. Hale. Unlike embezzlement and fraud." As the police led Victor away, he turned back to look at Isabella one last time. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and venomous. "You have no idea what you've started." "Yes, I do," Isabella replied. "I've started the end of your reign of terror." The door closed behind them, and suddenly the penthouse suite felt enormous and empty. Isabella sank onto the sofa, all the adrenaline that had kept her upright finally draining away. "Is it really over?" she asked, her voice small. "The immediate crisis is over," Danny said, gathering his equipment. "But Victor was right about one thing. He'll have excellent lawyers, and they'll try to discredit everything we've gathered." "What are our chances?" Ethan asked. "Better than they were this morning," Sarah said, settling beside Isabella on the couch. "We have his confession on tape, we have financial evidence, and now we have law enforcement attention. Even if the criminal charges don't stick, the civil case should be strong enough to protect the company. And the board will probably distance themselves from Victor as quickly as possible," Isabella said with a bitter laugh. "Nothing scares board members like media attention and federal investigations." Detective Rodriguez returned to the suite alone, his expression thoughtful. Ms. Grant, I'm going to need you and your team to come to the station and give formal statements. This is going to be a complex investigation, and we'll need everything documented properly. Of course, Isabella said, standing. Detective, what are the chances that the charges will stick? Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. Honestly mixed. Your recording is compelling, but his lawyers will argue entrapment, coercion, editing. The financial evidence is stronger, but white-collar cases are always challenging. What about my father's death? That's a cold case from 3 years ago. We can reopen it based on new evidence, but... Rodriguez shrugged. It's a tough road. The original investigation was thorough, and car accidents are notoriously difficult to prove as homicides after the fact. Isabella nodded, accepting the reality of the situation. I understand, but at least people will know the truth now. The truth has a way of coming out eventually. Rodriguez agreed. Sometimes it just takes longer than we'd like. As they prepared to leave the hotel, Ethan found himself walking beside Isabella toward the elevators. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors. How are you feeling? He asked. Tired, Isabella said honestly. Relieved, terrified, all at the same time. Terrified of what? Of what comes next. Victor's right, this isn't over. Even if he goes to prison, there will be civil suits, media scrutiny board investigations. Grant Industries could still be destroyed by all of this. Ethan stopped walking and turned to face her. Isabella, look at me. She met his eyes, and he saw the vulnerability she'd been hiding behind her CEO mask. Whatever comes next, we'll handle it, he said firmly. Together. You're not fighting this alone anymore. Ethan, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm choosing. Just like I chose to pretend to be your husband last night. Just like I chose to help you confront Victor today. I'm choosing you, Isabella. I'm choosing us. Her eyes filled with tears. What if there is no us? What if this crisis was the only thing holding us together? Then we'll find out, Ethan said simply. But I'd rather find out together than spend another 10 years wondering what might have been. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and they stepped inside with the others. As the doors closed and they began their descent toward whatever came next, Isabella reached for Ethan's hand. Together, she said quietly. Together, he agreed. The police station was a study in controlled chaos. Detectives moved between desks covered in case files, phones rang constantly, and the air smelled of coffee and stress and the peculiar institutional disinfectant that seemed universal to government buildings. Isabella's statement took 3 hours. She went through everything methodically: her marriage to Victor, the gradual erosion of trust, the discovery of the missing funds, the pattern of intimidation and manipulation that had characterized their relationship. Detective Rodriguez asked pointed questions, sometimes to have her clarify details, occasionally asking her to repeat sections for the court reporter. Ms. Grant, Rodriguez said during a break, I have to ask, why didn't you report your suspicions about your father's death earlier? Isabella was quiet for a moment, staring at her hands. Because I wasn't sure. Because grief makes you paranoid, makes you see conspiracies where there might just be coincidences. And because, she looked up. Because I was afraid no one would believe me. What changed? I realized that being afraid was exactly what Victor wanted. He spent 3 years keeping me isolated, keeping me doubting myself, making me think I was crazy for seeing patterns in his behavior. But today, with Ethan and Sarah supporting me, I remembered what it felt like to trust my own judgment. Rodriguez nodded. For what it's worth, your instincts seem sound. We've already started preliminary inquiries into your father's accident, and there are some questions worth pursuing. Such as the fact that Victor's car insurance paid out a substantial claim 2 days after your father's death. Damage consistent with a front-end collision claimed as vandalism while parked. Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. He hit my father's car. It's circumstantial, but it's worth investigating. We're also looking into Victor's whereabouts that evening, his phone records, financial transactions around that time period. Will any of that be enough? Maybe, maybe not. But it's more than we had this morning. When they finally left the police station, the sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The city moved around them with its usual energy, people hurrying home from work, taxis honking in traffic, the eternal pulse of New York life continuing, regardless of the personal dramas playing out in individual lives. I should call the board, Isabella said, as they stood on the steps of the precinct. They need to hear about this from me before they read about it in the morning papers. What will you tell them? The truth. That Victor Hale has been systematically undermining Grant Industries, that he's been arrested on fraud charges, and that the company will cooperate fully with the investigation. And if they vote to remove you as CEO. Isabella's smile was tired but determined. Then I'll fight that battle too. But at least now I know who my enemies are. Sarah approached them from where she'd been finishing her own statement. The Wall Street Journal wants an exclusive interview, she said. Rebecca Martinez, the reporter who's been investigating Victor's business practices. She's willing to hold the story until tomorrow morning to give you time to prepare a statement. Tell her yes, Phil, Isabella said, without hesitation. And set up interviews with the Times, the Post, anyone else who's interested. We control the narrative now, not Victor. Are you sure that's wise? Ethan asked. Media attention can be unpredictable. Media attention is the only thing that will keep Victor from making this all disappear, Isabella replied. He has connections, money, influence, but he can't control public opinion once the story is out there. Danny joined them, having finished coordinating with the police about the technical evidence. I've set up security for all of you, he said. Nothing obvious, but trained professionals who'll keep an eye on things until we know how Victor plans to respond. You think he'll retaliate? I think Victor Hale is facing the complete destruction of his carefully constructed life, Danny said seriously. Men like that don't go quietly. They fight dirty, and they don't care about collateral damage. As if summoned by their conversation, Isabella's phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number. Don't answer it, Ethan said immediately. But Isabella was already hitting the accept button. Isabella Grant. Hello, my dear. Victor's voice was smooth as silk, with no trace of the rage they'd witnessed earlier. I trust you're feeling proud of yourself. Where are you calling from? Isabella asked, putting the phone on speaker so the others could hear. That's not important. What's important is that you understand the position you've put yourself in. I understand it perfectly. You're going to prison. Victor's laugh was soft and cold. Am I? My lawyers seem to think otherwise. Apparently, your little recording session has some significant legal problems. Entrapment, coercion, illegal surveillance. The prosecutors are already having second thoughts. Isabella felt ice settle in her stomach, but she kept her voice steady. Even if the recording is thrown out, we have other evidence. Do you? Because my sources tell me that several of your key witnesses have suddenly become very reluctant to testify. Funny how people's memories become unreliable when they're facing pressure. What kind of pressure? The kind that reminds people about their mortgages, their children's college funds, their immigration status. You'd be amazed how quickly people remember that they never saw anything suspicious after all. Ethan grabbed the phone. "Victor, this is Ethan Cole. If you threaten anyone else..." "Mr. Cole, the devoted husband. Tell me, how devoted will you be when your construction company starts losing contracts? When your daughter finds herself facing trumped-up charges for underage drinking? When your entire life comes under scrutiny from very unfriendly people? You son of a..." Now. No need for profanity. I'm simply pointing out that actions have consequences. And your actions today will have consequences for everyone you care about. Isabella took the phone back. "What do you want, Victor?" "What I've always wanted. Your resignation as CEO of Grant Industries. A public apology for the false accusations you've made against me. And a very generous settlement to compensate me for the damage to my reputation. And if I refuse, then you'll discover just how far my reach extends. How many judges, prosecutors, and police officials owe me favors. How easy it is to destroy someone's life when you have the right connections and unlimited resources. You're bluffing. Check your company's stock price, my dear. Check your personal bank accounts. Check your credit rating. Check Emma Cole's college admissions status." Isabella's hands were shaking as she ended the call. Without a word, she pulled up her bank's app on her phone. Her personal account showed a balance of $0. Her company account had been frozen pending investigation. "He's fast," Sarah said, grimly checking her own phone. "Grant Industries' stock has dropped 30% in after-hours trading. There are news reports about financial irregularities and federal investigations." "Emma," Ethan said, pulling out his own phone with hands that weren't quite steady. "I need to call my daughter." The phone rang 4 times before Emma's familiar voice answered. "Dad, I was just about to call you. Something weird is happening with my Columbia admission." Ethan closed his eyes. "What kind of weird?" "They're saying there are questions about my application. Something about financial aid fraud and misrepresented family income." "Dad, what's going on?" "Emma, listen to me very carefully. I need you to pack a bag and go stay with your Aunt Mary tonight. Don't tell anyone where you're going, and don't answer calls from numbers you don't recognize." "Dad, you're scaring me." "I know, sweetheart. I'll explain everything later. But right now, I need you to trust me and do what I'm asking." "Okay, Dad." "Yeah. Are you in trouble?" Ethan looked at Isabella, who was staring at her phone with an expression of devastation and fury. "Yeah, Em. I think we all are." After Emma hung up, they stood in silence on the steps of the police station, watching the city move around them, with complete indifference to their crisis. Victor had moved faster than any of them had anticipated, using connections and resources they'd underestimated to strike back at every pressure point in their lives. "He's good," Danny said finally. "Better than I expected." "So what do we do now?" Sarah asked. Isabella straightened her shoulders, and when she looked up, there was something fierce and unbreakable in her eyes. "Now we fight back," she said, "but this time we play by his rules." "What do you mean?" "I mean Victor Hale isn't the only one with connections in this city. He's not the only one with resources and influence and the ability to make people's lives difficult." Isabella's smile was sharp as a blade. "He wants to destroy my company, fine. But I'm going to take him down with me." "Isabella," Ethan said carefully, "what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that Victor made one crucial mistake today. He showed us the full extent of his network, his methods, his pressure points. He revealed how he operates when he's desperate." She pulled out her phone and began dialing. "And now we use that information against him." "Who are you calling?" My father's oldest friend. A man who's been waiting 3 years for someone to give him a reason to investigate Victor Hale. Isabella's smile grew wider as the call connected. Hello, Judge Morrison. This is Isabella Grant. I think it's time we had that conversation about justice. As Isabella began to outline their situation to her father's friend, Ethan realized that they'd entered a new phase of their war with Victor. The gloves were off now, the rules of civilized engagement abandoned. What came next would determine not just the fate of Grant Industries, but the future of everyone involved. And somewhere in the city, Victor Hale was learning that underestimating Isabella Grant might be the biggest mistake of his very dangerous life. Judge Harold Morrison had been presiding over New York's federal courts for 32 years, and in that time he'd developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when someone was lying to him. The silver-haired man listened to Isabella's account with the focused attention of someone who'd been waiting for this exact conversation for 3 years. Your father came to see me 2 weeks before he died. Judge Morrison said, his voice heavy with old grief. He was concerned about Victor Hale's background, said something didn't add up about the man's financial history. James asked me to run a discreet inquiry through some federal contacts. What did you find? Isabella asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. Enough to raise serious questions. Victor Hale's consulting firm was incorporated just 6 months before he met you, but it showed revenue streams that should have taken years to develop. His previous marriage ended with his wife's mysterious death in a sailing accident, a wife who happened to be worth $50 million. Ethan felt the pieces clicking into place. He's done this before. 3 times that we could document. Always wealthy women, always mysterious accidents or suicides after the divorce proceedings became contentious. Judge Morrison's voice was grim. Your father was about to ask me to open a formal investigation when he died. And now I have cause. Your recording, combined with what we already suspected, gives us grounds for a RICO investigation. Racketeering conspiracy, multiple counts of fraud across state lines. Isabella closed her eyes, relief washing over her like a wave. How long will it take? Federal investigations move slowly, but Victor's actions tonight actually worked in our favor. By freezing your accounts and manipulating your daughter's college admission, he's committed federal crimes with electronic evidence trails. We can move on those immediately. What about the local charges? Detective Rodriguez said Victor's lawyers might get the recording thrown out. Judge Morrison's smile was sharp. Let them try. I have friends in the prosecutor's office who've been looking for an excuse to take on Victor Hale for years. This gives them everything they need. The conversation continued for another hour, with Judge Morrison outlining the legal strategy that would unfold over the coming weeks. Federal agents would raid Victor's offices, his home, his consulting firm. Financial experts would trace every transaction, every connection, every suspicious pattern in his business dealings. The full weight of the federal justice system would come down on Victor Hale like an avalanche. There's one more thing, Judge Morrison said, as they prepared to end the call. James left something with me before he died. He said if anything happened to him, I should give it to you. What kind of something? A safety deposit box key and a letter. He said you'd understand what to do with it when the time came. Isabella's breath caught. He knew. He knew Victor was dangerous. Your father was many things, but he wasn't naive. He loved you enough to take precautions. After they hung up, Isabella stared at her phone for a long moment. Around them, the city continued its eternal rhythm, but she felt like she was standing at the center of a storm that was finally beginning to turn in their favor. What happens now? Sarah asked. Now we wait, Isabella said. And we let Victor dig his own grave. As if summoned by her words, her phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed Rebecca Martinez from the Wall Street Journal. Ms. Grant, I've been following the developments tonight. Are you prepared to give me that exclusive interview? More than prepared, Isabella said. But I want to make one thing clear. This isn't just about corporate fraud. This is about a predator who's been destroying women's lives for decades, and it's time someone stopped him. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of interviews, legal meetings, and carefully orchestrated media appearances. Isabella told her story to the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and CNN. She spoke with federal agents, forensic accountants, and cybercrime specialists. Each conversation added another layer to the case against Victor Hale, another piece of evidence in what was becoming the white-collar crime story of the decade. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Detective Rodriguez called to tell her that Victor's bail had been revoked. What happened? Isabella asked. Your friend Judge Morrison had a conversation with the presiding judge, pointed out that Mr. Hale had already demonstrated a willingness to intimidate witnesses and manipulate financial institutions. Flight risk was deemed too high. So he's in jail. Federal holding facility pending trial. And based on what the FBI found in his offices yesterday, he's going to be there for a very long time. Isabella sank into her office chair, feeling truly safe for the first time in years. Grant Industries stock had recovered most of its losses once the media made it clear that Isabella was the victim, not the perpetrator. Her personal accounts had been unfrozen, Emma's college admission had been restored with an apology from Columbia's administration, and Ethan's construction company had mysteriously started receiving new contract offers. It's over, she said to Ethan, who was sitting across from her desk reviewing the latest legal documents. Victor's finished. Are you sure about that? The FBI found evidence of at least 12 other victims over the past 15 years. Women whose deaths or disappearances suddenly make a lot more sense. Victor's not getting out of prison, Ethan. Ever. Ethan looked up from the papers. And what about us? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with all the uncertainty and hope of the past week. They'd been so focused on surviving Victor's attacks that they hadn't had time to process what their reunion meant, what they wanted from each other after 10 years apart. I don't know, Isabella said honestly. A week ago, I thought I'd never see you again. Now you're here in my office helping me pick up the pieces of my life. It feels surreal. What feels surreal about it? The fact that you stayed. The fact that you chose to fight for me when you could have walked away. Isabella stood and moved to the windows looking out at the city below. The fact that after everything that's happened, I still love you. The words slipped out before she could stop them, honest and vulnerable and terrifying. For a moment, the only sound in the office was the distant hum of traffic far below. Isabella. Ethan's voice was soft, and she heard him stand, heard his footsteps crossing the room toward her. Look at me. She turned and found him standing close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could smell the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with coffee and the stress of the past few days. I love you too, he said simply. I never stopped loving you. But I need to know that this is real, that we're not just bonding over shared trauma and adrenaline. How do we know that? We take it slow. We date like normal people without the threat of corporate sabotage hanging over our heads. We introduce you to Emma properly, not as a crisis situation, but as the woman I'm falling in love with all over again. Isabella reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines that hadn't been there 10 years ago. What if we're different people now? What if we don't fit together the way we used to? Then we figure out how we fit together now. Ethan captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. Isabella, I'm not going anywhere. We have time to figure this out. Do we? Because in about 2 hours, I have a board meeting where they're going to want to discuss the company's future leadership. There's talk of bringing in outside management, of restructuring, of, "Hey," Ethan's voice was firm. "You saved this company. You exposed a criminal conspiracy that could have destroyed thousands of jobs. The board would be insane to remove you now." Boards have been known to make insane decisions. Not this time. Sarah's voice came from the doorway, where she stood with a tablet in her hands and a smile on her face. "Sorry to interrupt, but I thought you'd want to see this." She handed Isabella the tablet, which showed an email from the board chairman. "Miss Grant," Isabella read aloud, "in light of recent events and your exemplary leadership during this crisis, the board has voted unanimously to extend your contract as CEO for an additional 5 years, with a substantial increase in compensation and autonomy. We also wish to formally apologize for any doubts we may have expressed regarding your leadership. Sincerely, Robert Chen, Chairman of the Board." Isabella stared at the email, then looked up at Sarah. "Robert Chen. Any relation to—" "My father," Sarah said with a grin, "who it turns out has been suspicious of Victor Hale for years and was just waiting for someone to give him ammunition to act on those suspicions. Your father's the board chairman. Family connections run deep in this city," Sarah said. "And my family believes in protecting people who deserve protection." Isabella sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of fortune. A week ago, she'd been facing the destruction of everything she'd worked for. Now she had job security, Victor was in prison, and the man she'd never stopped loving was standing in her office, promising not to leave again. "It's too much," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "It's all too much." "Good too much or bad too much?" Ethan asked, moving to sit on the edge of her desk. "Good. Definitely good. Just overwhelming." "Then let's take it one step at a time," Ethan said. "Starting with dinner. Real dinner at a normal restaurant where we talk about normal things like favorite movies and childhood memories and what we want to do next weekend." "What about Emma? When do I meet her properly?" "When you're ready. When we're both sure this is what we want." Ethan's expression grew serious. "Isabella, Emma's the most important thing in my life. I won't introduce her to someone unless I'm certain that person is going to stick around." "And are you certain?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, studying her face. "I'm certain that I want to find out. I'm certain that what we had 10 years ago was real, and what we're feeling now is real too. Everything else, we'll figure out as we go." Isabella nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over her for the first time in years. "Okay, one step at a time. Starting with dinner. Starting with dinner." 6 months later, Isabella stood in the same restaurant where their story had begun, but this time the circumstances were completely different. Le Bernardin was hosting a private celebration for the conclusion of Victor Hale's trial life in prison without the possibility of parole plus restitution to his victims totaling over $200 million. "To justice," Judge Morrison said, raising his glass in a toast to the assembled group, "and to the brave woman who refused to let a monster win." "To second chances," Isabella replied, looking at Ethan across the table. "And to the people who remind us that we don't have to face our battles alone." Emma Cole, now a freshman at Columbia, and every bit as brilliant and stubborn as her father had promised, raised her own glass. "To my future stepmother, who's way too good for my dad but hopefully won't figure that out until after the wedding." "Emma," Ethan protested, though he was grinning, "what you've been carrying around that ring for 2 months. Everyone knows you're going to propose. The only question is when you're going to work up the courage." Isabella nearly choked on her wine. "Ring." Ethan shot his daughter a look that promised retribution later, then turned to Isabella with a sheepish expression. I was going to wait until our 1-year anniversary of the night we met again. But that's still 6 months away. I know, which is why I've been carrying it around trying to work up the nerve to change my timeline. Isabella stared at him, her heart doing complicated gymnastics in her chest. Ethan Cole, are you telling me you want to marry me? I'm telling you that I've wanted to marry you since I was 22 years old, and I'm tired of waiting for the perfect moment. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. I'm telling you that I love you, that Emma loves you, and that we want you to be part of our family officially. He practiced that speech, Emma said helpfully. Like a lot. It was getting embarrassing. Emma, you're supposed to be helping, Ethan said. I am helping. Isabella say yes so he stops pacing around the apartment muttering to himself. Isabella looked around the table at the faces watching her expectantly. Judge Morrison, who'd become like a surrogate father to her. Sarah, who'd become her closest friend and most trusted advisor. Danny, who'd kept them all safe during the darkest days. Emma, who'd accepted her into the family with the matter-of-fact generosity of someone who understood that love multiplied rather than divided. And Ethan holding a ring box with hands that weren't quite steady looking at her with the same expression he'd worn 10 years ago when he'd told her he loved her for the first time. Ask me properly, she said softly. Ethan smiled and slid off his chair, going down on one knee beside her table. The other diners in the restaurant had started to notice, but Isabella only had eyes for the man kneeling in front of her. Isabella Grant, he said, opening the box to reveal a simple, elegant diamond that caught the light like a promise. Will you marry me? Will you take a chance on us again? Will you let me spend the rest of my life making up for the 10 years we lost? Isabella looked at the ring, then at his face, then at the family they'd somehow created from the ashes of their individual disasters. Yes, she said, and the word came out like a sob and a laugh combined. Yes to all of it. The restaurant erupted in applause as Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for her all along. I love you, she whispered against his lips as he kissed her. I love you too, he whispered back. No more running away. No more letting fear make our decisions. No more pretending to be married when we can do it for real. Speaking of which, Emma said loudly, I've already started planning the wedding. I figure we'll need at least 6 months to do it properly, and I have very strong opinions about flowers and music and… Emma, Ethan warned. Fine. I'll let you two have some input. But I'm picking my dress, and I want to walk both of you down the aisle. Isabella laughed, the sound bright and full of joy. Deal. As the evening wound down and their friends began to leave, Isabella and Ethan found themselves alone at their table. Hands intertwined, the weight of the ring still strange and wonderful on her finger. Do you ever think about what would have happened if Victor hadn't shown up that night? Isabella asked. If we'd just had a normal dinner and caught up like regular people. I think we would have found our way back to each other eventually, Ethan said. Maybe it would have taken longer, maybe we would have been more careful, but I think we were always meant to end up here. Even after 10 years apart. Especially after 10 years apart. We needed that time to become the people we were meant to be. You needed to build your company and find your strength. I needed to raise Emma and learn what really mattered. We couldn't have been right for each other at 22 the way we're right for each other now. Isabella considered this, thinking about the frightened young woman. She'd been the one who'd chosen duty over love because she hadn't believed she was strong enough to have both. I used to think love was about finding someone who completed you, she said. But I think it's actually about finding someone who inspires you to complete yourself. Very philosophical for someone who just got engaged. Very romantic for someone who builds things for a living. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the city lights twinkle beyond the restaurant's windows. The same view that had witnessed their separation 10 years ago was now witness to their reunion, their engagement, their promise to build a future together. Ethan, when we get married, I want to keep my name professionally. But personally, I like the sound of Isabella Cole. I like the sound of it too. And I want Emma to be my maid of honor. She'll love that. She's already appointed herself wedding coordinator, in case you hadn't noticed. I noticed. I also noticed that she's amazing, and I can't wait to officially be her stepmother. She feels the same way about you. She told me last week that she's never seen me as happy as I've been these past few months. Have you been happy? Ethan brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to the engagement ring. Isabella, I've been happier than I ever thought possible. And the best part is, this is just the beginning. The beginning of what? Of everything. Marriage, family, growing old together, building something that lasts. His eyes grew serious. Of proving that sometimes love really does conquer all. Even corporate conspiracies and homicidal ex-husbands. Especially those. Isabella laughed, the sound echoing through the nearly empty restaurant. In a few hours, the sun would rise on a new day, bringing with it the continued challenges of running a major corporation, planning a wedding, and blending their lives together. There would be board meetings and family dinners, arguments about wedding venues, and discussions about where to live, the ordinary complications that came with choosing to build a life with another person. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, there was just this moment, the weight of a ring on her finger, the warmth of Ethan's hand in hers, and the absolute certainty that they'd found their way home to each other at last. Ready to go? Ethan asked, standing and offering her his arm. Ready, Isabella said, taking his arm and letting him lead her toward the exit. As they walked through the restaurant where their second chance had begun, Isabella thought about the journey that had brought them here, the pain of separation, the loneliness of the years between the terror of Victor's attacks, and finally the joy of rediscovering that some love stories don't end, they just wait for the right moment to begin again. Outside, the October air carried the same bite it had 6 months ago, but everything else had changed. They had each other now, officially and permanently. They had Emma eager and excited about their future. They had careers they loved and a family they'd chosen, and the promise of decades to figure out how to be happy together. What are you thinking about? Ethan asked as they waited for their car. I'm thinking about that night when you sat at table 17, planning to get closure. And instead, I got you back. We got each other back, Isabella corrected. And we got so much more than we ever thought possible. Any regrets? Isabella looked at him, this man who'd stood by her through the worst crisis of her life, who'd chosen to fight for her when she'd forgotten how to fight for herself, who'd given her not just his love, but his daughter's acceptance and his unwavering faith in their future. Not a single one, she said. You, only that it took us 10 years to find our way back to each other. Then let's not waste any more time. Deal, Ethan said, kissing her softly as their car pulled up to the curb. For the rest of our lives. As they drove through the city toward the apartment they now shared, Isabella watched the lights of Manhattan blur past the windows and thought about the unpredictability of fate. A week ago, she'd been alone, afraid, and convinced that love was a luxury she couldn't afford. Tonight, she was engaged to the love of her life with a daughter-to-be, who'd already started planning their wedding, and a future that stretched out before them, bright with possibility. Sometimes she thought the best chapters of your life began when you thought the story was over. Sometimes the most beautiful endings were actually new beginnings in disguise. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, the person you needed most would appear exactly when you needed them, ready to pretend to be your husband, until the pretending became real. "I love you, Mrs. Cole," Ethan said softly, as they pulled into their building's parking garage. "I love you too, Mr. Cole," Isabella replied, and for the first time in 10 years, she was exactly where she belonged. The end.